Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar, Looking Ahead, Lessons from Trailblazers and the Future of Family Justice. Today's webinar is part of the Department for Education's DFJ Trailblazers programme. My name is Morgan Nasser-Finlayson. I'm a Principal Consultant at Mutual Ventures and the Programme Manager for the Trailblazers programme. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Lisa Harker, who is the director of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and I will introduce her properly in a moment. But to begin with, for a bit of background, the Trailblazers programme began as a pilot programme running from 2024 to 2025. The aim was to reduce delays in public law family justice by supporting 5 court areas or designated family judge areas to understand what was driving delay locally and to design and implement their own solutions to tackle that delay. Alongside that pilot, a guided learning programme supported a wider group of 15 more DFJ areas to work through a similar process and draw directly on learning from the Trailblazers. This has helped to spread insight about common challenges and approaches that were already being tested in practice. Building on that work, the programme then moved to a second phase starting last year, the National Learning and Strategy Programme. From September 2025, guided learning was reopened to all DFJ areas in England, with a focus on sharing learning, building capability, and supporting areas to reflect on and strengthen their own local practice. Through both phases of this programme over the past 2 years, we have been really privileged to have worked with more than 30 DFJ areas across England, which amounts to more than 400 stakeholders. Within the National Learning and Strategy Programme was also the System Functionality workstream, which was looking at what the family justice system as a whole needs at a national and local level to work more effectively overall, which includes data, lines of performance management and accountability, and how different parts of the system connect and interact to help inform the Department for Education's priorities and contributions to a national family justice strategy. And that is what we're really going to be talking about here today. With the Trailblazers programme coming to an end, what is next in the world of family justice? That big upcoming piece is, of course, the upcoming family justice strategy. As a quick check and a quick sense test with our attendees today, when I say family justice strategy, are you aware of the upcoming family justice strategy? If you just select either yes or no, it should have popped up on your screens now. I'll give you a couple of seconds to click on that. It may not be coming up for me just yet, but if it is popping up at all for you, do let me know, or feel free to use the Q&A function to flag whether or not this is something that you are currently aware of. So 58% of you said yes, which is a good number. But there is still that 42% who said no. So what we were slightly anticipating for today's conversation is that perhaps if you've been involved in the Trailblazers program, you may well have been aware of the family justice strategy coming up and what that might mean. But there's still a really good proportion of you who have attended here today who've said no. So hopefully this is the conversation then for you to explain what it is and what we know so far. Could I also ask you to now use the Q&A function to think about, when I say family justice strategy, what do you think that means for you in your profession? What impacts might that have for you? What might it mean for you in practice? I'll give you a couple of seconds just to use the Q&A function for that. being given more unrealistic deadlines with less, an increased focus on data, a couple of things coming through at the moment, addressing delays to proceedings, improved outcomes for children. Any more for any more? Not a million miles off in many cases, but I'm going to just quickly introduce and talk through a couple of things of what is going to be coming up with the family justice strategy. So you should be able to see on your screen in front of you a quick visual. So, following a recommendation made by the National Audit Office last year, the government committed to publishing its first family justice strategy, which will set out the system-wide actions that are required to improve the outcomes of children and families that go through the system across public and private law. Through development of that strategy, government officials are working closely with lots of different system partners to explore how to drive improved system performance, accountability, strengthen early support and resolution, modernise family law, and improve court experience for children and families, including how to make proceedings less adversarial, which, as through the Trailblazers, we know is something that consistently comes up. Officials are also exploring how to improve the data and the evidence that we collect through the system, which includes how to support increased transparency in particular and improve the understanding of outcomes. The strategy is due to be published later in this year, so do keep an eye out. Lisa, if I could bring you in here, before I ask you for an initial reflection on those elements of the upcoming family justice strategy. You have been in this space for a while now. You have huge experience and expertise in family justice, and you can most often be seen expert witnessing at select committees, most notably the Justice Committee last year. Could you quickly tell us a little bit more about what the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory does, and then take us through your initial reflections on those particular aspects of the strategy?
Thanks, Morgan. It's very nice to be here. Well, Nuffield Family Justice Observatory is an independent organisation funded by a foundation, the Nuffield Foundation. And we have been set up to shine a light on what happens in the family justice system using data and research to help professionals to see how the system is functioning. It's in some ways, extraordinary that that doesn't exist already. Many other systems, if you worked in health or education, there are a plethora of organisations that help you to see how what you're doing compares to others, or what happens, before you work with a child or after you've finished working with a child. The Family Justice Observatory sort of seeks to fill the gap in the family justice system by helping to reflect on how the system is working. And then we use that insight to try to bring people together to galvanise change. And, much like yourselves, we're working across England and Wales with a range of professionals and working with children and families to understand their experiences. On the strategy, I think this is a really exciting moment because I think we haven't ever really had a strategy for the family justice system before, not only for this government, but any government actually. And if you look back, it's 15 years since the government last did a review of family justice. The Norgrove Review was published 15 years ago. And that review was quite critical of what it saw as a system that wasn't really a system. It talked about how the family justice system was very fragmented, lots of different agencies working, but with no clear sense of direction, and a great deal of difficulty in terms of being able to see how it was functioning and how it could function better. And certainly when you talk to professionals in the system, all of whom are working hard to achieve change for children, there's quite often frustration surfaced about how difficult it is to achieve what professionals want for children because of other parts of the system. It's normally possible to say, well, we're trying to do something here, but we're struggling because another part of the system isn't working well. And so that fragmentation is really problematic. And that was noted 15 years ago. We're still in the same place largely that we were then. And so the government's decision to produce a strategy, I think, is a great opportunity to start to think about how you can bind together all the various agencies who work in family justice around a clear mission and some short-term objectives that we can all work on together. So, really that's what a strategy is, I think, just telling you what you're trying to achieve, what in the short term your objectives are, and then how do you think you might measure those objectives. And as you set out, there are some areas where there's quite a lot of consensus that change is needed. But what we really need is clarity that we're all going to be working on those things together and that there's a structure across our system, across these fragmented services that can help to oversee and drive forward change. So I think it's a great opportunity for change.
Yes. And as you sort of rightly point out with the Norgrove Review 15 years ago, one of the sort of most critical aspects of that was pointing out that the family justice system is not a system at all. It is a collection of professionals who urgently need to work together in order to achieve the right outcomes for children and families, but without that line that connects them and enables them to work together sort of outside of an informal network and has worked so for many years on that basis. So I agree as well that having a strategy that brings some of these elements together into one place, where it can be worked on by everyone who's involved in family justice, is also a really exciting sort of element that, as you say, hasn't really been seen before. There has nothing really previously been something that brings together local authorities, CAFCAS, judiciary, solicitors, barristers, just anybody who is involved in this and is trying to achieve the right sort of security for children and families. If we think about the sort of key elements that we flashed up a little bit more in detail, let's start with the early support aspect for families, improving pre-proceedings practice, things under the Families First reforms such as family group decision making. So across Trailblazers, early support was consistently a really critical lever for reducing delay and improving the experiences for families. A lot of the areas that we worked with highlighted the huge importance of being able to use pre-proceedings more purposefully rather than a sort of inevitable slippery slope to head towards court, where you ensure that families understand the process, that you're identifying wider family networks earlier, and you're actually creating space for meaningful engagement before you escalate to court. Family group decision making and similar approaches are seen as particularly valuable here, where it's embedded as part of a wider system approach rather than in isolation or too late in the process. So, my question to you, Lisa, is why should we be focusing more on making sure that pre-proceedings practice does genuinely support families rather than being overly procedural in a way, as well as having the right procedure and security in place to make sure that it's doing the right things?
I think first and foremost, professionals recognise that early intervention, matters. It's important. It's important for children and families to intervene at the early possible stage and try and resolve difficulties before they escalate. So that's pre-proceedings, if you like. And I think that's widely acknowledged across our professions. I think we've had, over the last decade, a period of austerity and cuts to public services that has shifted a focus away from that. But we now have a government agenda that says it wants to address that. And, we have a children's minister who says there's a big reset coming. We want to try to shift the system towards early intervention. So that matters. That matters for children, it matters for families, it matters for the system because the earlier you can support families to resolve difficulties, the better. But when it comes to families where there is real concerns about a safety of the child, some entrenched difficulties, and you're getting closer towards thinking whether proceedings are necessary. The pre-proceedings moment is a chance to take stock and ensure that you've done everything you possibly can to support a family to turn the situation around. And as part of that, asking whether there are members of the extended family who might be able to step in and support a child is key, is effective. We know from all the evidence that family group conferencing can be very effective in keeping children with their families, and avoiding proceedings. But it has to be done well and it has to be done purposefully, as you say. We know at the moment that about 80% of local authorities have some sort of family group decision making initiative in place in the local authority, but that it's not well used still, and that referrals into that service are quite varied in terms of numbers. Recent research that foundations have published, which was undertaken by Cascade and Quorum, showed that there was huge variation between local authorities in terms of how much use was being made of family group decision making. And there was also, clear evidence of the need of a culture shift because many families were very reticent to be involved in those discussions as well. So there's a sort of cultural shift that's needed in terms of embedding family group decision making as an approach across children's social care, as well as in proceedings or in pre-proceedings. So that element is changing. We have in the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill that's currently going through Parliament a measure that will require all local authorities to use a family group decision making approach. There's good evidence about family group conferencing, a particular kind of approach, having benefits for children and families. And there's a need to ensure there's some, integrity in terms of the approach that is taken. But I think this is all part of a shift towards being mindful of the need to think about extended family from the very beginning when a child becomes known to services, and building that into processes. Having said all of that, I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that if we're going to have one system that works together for families, that at every single stage there needs to be an attempt to sort of problem solve the situation for families. So even once a family enters proceedings, there's an opportunity there to use the authority of the court to try and problem solve the situation for the family. And we know that from family drug and alcohol courts that can be very effective. So pre-proceedings matters, doing it well. Pre-proceedings is important, let's not forget that. But also proceedings themselves don't have to be an inevitability for those families who reach proceedings. They can be an important moment to help turn a family's life around.
Absolutely. And just to tag on the back of something that you said there about the sort of the use of family group decision making and how this does exist in many local authorities already. Something in particular that we learned both as part of working on developing best practice support for family group decision making, but also through the Trailblazers program, was the importance of the connection and the relationship and the link between the family group decision making team and whoever it is who is taking the child and their family through the court process, because it's not necessarily a given that those two teams are necessarily working together, sitting together, or interacting with each other. And under a different landscape, under Families First, it's going to become more and more important that those two sides of the coin sort of are closer together than ever. You also sort of very neatly segue into one of the next questions I was going to ask you about that experience in court. And you mentioned family drug and alcohol courts. That one of the other sort of areas or priorities is about improving that court experience, making it more trauma informed, expanding those problem solving approaches, which are so highly rated and thought of under family drug and alcohol courts, and much more aware of the experiences of parents and children. Some of the things that we picked up during the last 2 years on Trailblazers has really reinforced how the court itself can contribute to delay, disengagement, and also just real distress for families. A lot of areas were reflecting on the impact of language that's used, the environment, the pace, and also those professional interactions on parents and children. But problem solving approaches like FDAC really do demonstrate the role of the court as that kind of agent of change because they're able to use the family's engagement with proceedings as the opportunity to address any underlying issues that mean you have to go to court alongside the actual decision making. We really do think that a lot more areas can definitely learn from these approaches and apply that more generally to their ways of working, whether that's changes to language or how professionals interact with families and children. But from your perspective, where full problem solving courts like FDACs aren't currently in place, what can local areas do to adopt elements of that problem solving practice? Because we know that the challenge for the coming months is to try and avoid problem solving really becoming quite postcode dependent or a bit niche, but trying to embed those principles more widely. So, what do you think can be done here?
So I think we have to acknowledge that our processes around court haven't really been designed with families in mind. And I think a starting point is to try to reset that in some ways. And, a good way to start that is to invite families to tell us about how to improve their experiences of court. But what we know from research is the sorts of things they might likely tell us about their experiences include a difficulty of understanding what to expect when to come to court. So the pre-court information is often very poor. A difficulty of understanding what goes on in proceedings, who's who, what people are talking about. The language they're using can be very alienating. Families can be sitting at the back of the court, not understanding who's playing which role and, how the process runs. So thinking about how to, use everyday language, bring the family to the front of the court, explain who's who at the beginning, all of that can make a big difference to a family's experience. And then thinking about what happens at the end of proceedings is also really important. Thinking about who explains to a family what has been decided and why, and what happens next in terms of the support that they receive. So I think those are the types of things that families will talk about when you ask them about their experience of proceedings. And in some ways they are, they're relatively simple. They're about human interaction and about the kind of clarity and ease with which people can understand our services as families would explain about any service that they use. We were really struck at Nuffield Family Justice Observatory when we did a lot of work during the pandemic to study how families were experiencing remote hearings and asking them about how to improve their experience. And really what they talked about was not unique to the fact that the hearings were being run by video or telephone. It was really that proceedings were quite difficult to understand and engage with if you're a family. So those things can make a big difference. Problem solving is a step beyond that. That's a foundation for problem solving, but real problem solving courts use the moment of court and the authority of the judge to bring a team around a family and try and resolve their difficulties at that stage. FDAC teams are multidisciplinary teams that can help families address some of the long-standing difficulties that have resulted in them coming to proceedings in the first place. And they've been shown to be really effective, that combination of knowing that you're in court is a very serious moment and the judge has the authority to remove your child alongside the provision of some really high quality support can really help turn families' lives around. And where it's not possible to do so, families also report much more positive experiences of the way that they've experienced the court because they feel they've been given a chance, they've been listened to, they understand why it's in their child's best interest for a child to be removed into care. So that kind of problem solving is what we see in FDAC, and that's what I think we would like to see in other courts, but it does require more than an improved experience. It requires the provision of that multidisciplinary team.
Mm. And I absolutely agree with it's sometimes the ways in which the process runs for the families that makes the biggest difference because during both the pilot and this phase of the program, we undertook a couple of pieces where we spoke to mums, we spoke to young people about what it was like for them to go through proceedings against how it was meant to happen in practice and also what happened post proceedings for them. And some of the things that really stood out for where things had gone well, or as well as they could be, for these parents and for these young people, was where there was kindness from the professionals that they engaged with. That, you walk into a courtroom and there's a judge looking down and is leans over to say something to you directly, this terrifying moment. And the one thing that the judge says is, you're doing a really good job. You are looking at the changes that you need to make. You're making really good progress. You are doing great. Keep doing it. And that was the one thing that one mum specifically remembered from her experience in court was just that one kind interaction, which in a profession like this, when we are so busy, there is so much to do and we see and hear really difficult things day in and day out. That was the thing that made the biggest difference to this mum was that kind interaction and how people who had gone through problem solving approaches, who'd gone through FDAC courts in particular, felt, as you say, that even though their child was ultimately removed at the end, that they felt, yes, that is the right decision for my child. It's where they will be safest. It is completely right. And I've gone through this process and I've been supported through it. But I feel that this is the right outcome, even though it's not necessarily to keep my child with me, which is huge.
Yeah. And I think it's worth saying that those acts of kindness are, you see them everywhere in family justice. You see amazing interactions between judges and families and lawyers and families. But I think to go back to the idea of the strategy, we don't foreground a focus on improving families' experiences of the family justice system at the moment. We don't measure it. We don't state it as one of our objectives as a system. And if we did, we need to ensure that that's something that we all buy into, because at every stage of the process, a family may come into contact with, will come into contact with a social worker, with a local authority, lawyer, with a solicitor, with a barrister, with a judge, with a clerk who is in the court. And every one of those interactions matters. So we need a system that's all focusing on improving experiences for families and feels that that's part of, our objective as a system to make sure that they have the best possible experience. A strategy can really, I think, help galvanize that. At the moment, really what we're telling courts is work as hard as you can to work fast. And delays matter, but delays are not the only measure of success here.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And sort of taking that point and thinking more about what is it that we are measuring, what is good in the world of family justice, and thinking about data and how you measure whether things are going well. Obviously, data was a huge recurring theme across both the pilot for Trailblazers and also for this phase of the program, both as that enabler of improvement, but also a really, really persistent challenge to triangulate data sources and say, what is actually happening in any given area? Is this positive? Is this negative? What does this trend mean? So a lot of the areas that we worked with were really valuing the opportunities to look really deeply at their own data, particularly from that local authority perspective, but also really identify that there were big limitations around the consistency of data, accessibility, and actually, as I say, the ability to link different data sources across agencies, where in any given local area, you have the local authority, you have the courts data, and you have CAFCAS data, which can't necessarily talk to one another. So you already have three different perspectives of what is causing delays, what is going well or not well in our local system. And really often the data that was available was really different across different stakeholders in a single LFJB. So really, in an ideal world, a single shared version of the truth benefits everyone to be able to develop and agree what the priorities and actions are because you already have a common data set that you agree on. And there's really kind of a growing recognition that data also needs to support learning and reflection, not just performance monitoring, but performance monitoring is equally challenging in this situation because, as you say, what is the right thing to measure to say this is how the system is performing and it is performing as needed? So what does useful data look like for local family justice systems? And then how does that then become useful data for national systems and the National Family Justice Board, for example?
So this is a huge area of interest to us at Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. We have for years been saying we do not have good quality data in the family justice system, and that urgently needs to be addressed. I think we've got to start with what are we trying to achieve. So I think again, going back to the strategy, it's about setting some clear measures of success that we can all come and come around and buy into and work towards. When you talk to professionals, the first thing they say is we want to know whether we make children's lives better. What are the outcomes for children? So that has to be part of our set of metrics. Do the decisions that are made at every stage of the family justice system result in children feeling better about themselves, having good relationships, and moving forward with their lives? And that's not something we currently measure, but we need to work towards measures that can help us understand that. Secondly, as we've talked about, actually experiences of the system matter regardless of the outcome. So actually having a good experience of the family justice system in itself is important. At the moment, we don't ask children or parents or other family members how they experience the system. We don't ask for that feedback. Unlike most public services that obsess over some of that data, we don't do that in family justice. So again, that's a shift that I think we need to make. And of course, we need to measure timeliness. And as you say, a single version of the truth is important. It is a challenge to work across these multiple agencies and triangulate data, but it's not unique to family justice to have multiple professionals involved in the lives of families. There are many services that have similar complexity. So at a local level, we need some agreement about the version of the truth that we're going to work with. And yes, that does need to involve how quickly decisions are made. But I think one of the challenges of the moment is that the speed of proceedings, and I don't want to downplay how important it is to ensure that children's lives, their permanency, their, being able to move forward as a family is really important, and dragging out that decision-making process is not good for children and families. But at the moment, our only national measures are really around the speed of decision making. And it doesn't take into account other things that families tell us are important, how they experience proceedings, and of course, what happens next. Um, one measure I would like us to be looking at as an example of needing to address our system and work towards better outcomes for children and families is the level of recurrence in public proceedings. So the fact that so many families who have children taken into a care will return to court with a subsequent child. Now, nobody in our system thinks that that's a good thing. We know that it's a sign, if you like, of our failure to address the underlying difficulties that families have. And when you see levels of recurrence, it's a sign that we have not been able to use the court process as the turning point in a family's life, which,
Mm.
given what a serious intervention it is in a family's life, we have to start seeing it as an opportunity for a turning point in a family's life. So by measuring, currently don't measure recurrence at national or local level. We're reliant on research studies to tell us about those findings. But if we did, we would start to ask ourselves, how can we improve that experience of court and pre-proceedings, but make sure that at every stage we're doing everything we can to help a family turn their lives around. So that sort of measure would really change some of the conversations that we're having. But ultimately, it is also about ensuring that wherever you are in the system, you're able to see the same metrics. As you say, that version of the truth needs to be the same.
Mm. And I mean, particularly thinking about the recurrent point, my hope is that things to do with the single unique identifier will help with that to some extent, because one of the challenges within there, as you say, is knowing where people are in the system and being able to actually pinpoint and say, is this coming back around again? As you say, it's research based, but it's also anecdotal when you talk to social workers and talk to judges who recognize people coming back around and asking, well, what happened with the previous order? What was it that broke down here? And thinking about the single version of the truth point as well, this was particularly pertinent in Trailblazers, where, for example, you may be working in a court area, so a court that serves one local authority, two local authorities, 12 local authorities, who are all collecting their own data and funneling towards one place. And one of the really big things that came out of both the pilot and then tracking across to phase two was, are we all collecting the same things, and are we calling the data the same things? Because that can be a real point of contention of, we're tracking the same thing, but we have two different names for it, and we can't quite decide which one it should be. So it borrowed very heavily from examples like the Warrington pre-proceedings pilot that was previously done by the Department for Education, to say, well, what's the maximum sort of amount of data that a local authority could collect to have a really clear picture of the very start of this process. Who is it that is making their way towards court, and where can we intervene most sensibly? We didn't quite do the full whack of the Warrington's gold standard. We did what we called the Warrington bronze standard in Trailblazers, but that has really clearly mapped across to both the pilot work that was done for data mapping to say, okay, which local authorities are collecting what? How much are we collecting in common? Can we all agree what we will all collect and then bring together for combined analysis, which then contributes to a bigger local sort of data set and picture that we can analyze together? An example of which was really clear in both Wolverhampton and also Essex, where they both took the very sort of conscious decision to do this and to build up what it was that they were collecting to combine. Central London also managed to do this, so it's not impossible to do this. They had 12 local authorities, and they were able to agree that they would collect a set of data for 12 months that they could analyse as an entire region to have a single version of the truth in there. And that really did help to build up that better understanding across different agencies and different partners of what is it that's actually going on. It meant more data informed and driven conversations. The sort of natural lead on point, which that then sort of goes to, is then who is then looking at that data? Who is managing and assessing and determining what is going on in a particular local system? Um, and one of the sort of particular levers of that is naturally the local family justice boards as that board to see how is the local system performing, what is it that we could be doing differently. So thinking about how local family justice systems look at their data and look at their drivers of delay and to improve their ways of working. One of the things I wanted to ask you about you next was really that kind of the core principle that we saw in Trailblazers is that there are a lot of shared drivers of delays, but they look very different in different places. So, for example, pre-proceedings practice in two different areas might hugely vary, and that might then have an impact on how cases progress to court. Court capacity may play out differently in Yorkshire than it does in Suffolk. There's huge variations, and local analysis did help areas to move beyond more high level explanations of drivers of delay and focus on really specific pinch points, both in the pilot and also in phase two. But it also really highlighted that progress and fixing those local drivers of delays doesn't always depend on one individual initiative or one individual organization improving aspects of their practice. It really heavily depends on how those different partners work together and use specifically the forums like the local family justice board to sustain that collective ownership of improvement. So what would you say to the kind of evolving nature and role of local family justice boards and other partnership structures in local areas and how they can best support that shared problem solving across organizational boundaries?
So it's a great question, and I think it goes back to the conversation we had about this not being a system, but being a collection of services that try to work together. And if you go back to the Norgrove Review 15 years ago, his critique was that this needed some clear oversight and structure to bring together these different services to work together to resolve difficulties and, as you say, at a local level to address particular needs of that locality. We haven't really got in local family justice boards a strong structure of governance. There are some great local family justice boards that go out of their way to do some fantastic work, but they are very varied in terms of the level of intensity that they work at and the level of engagement they have with the professionals in their locality and indeed with children and families, which, in most cases is quite limited. But if you were to start from scratch and say, what kind of system do we need to help to drive change through our system, you would reinvent something like the local family justice board. So I think we've got the elements of something that needs to be strengthened. And I think that strengthening needs to come not just from bottom up, but from top down. So I think we need from the Family Justice Board, the National Family Justice Board, some really strong leadership and clarity about our purpose as a system and our short-term objectives and how we're going to measure them. And that should speak directly to local family justice boards, and the information between them should flow easily. So the National Family Justice Board can see what local family justice boards are doing. And at local level, we need good leadership, and that's, in some places already in place. But we also need good engagement. It ought to be, if you're a barrister, a solicitor, a social worker, a magistrate, or a judge, you ought to know about your local family justice board. You ought to want to be part of the conversations about how to improve the system in your area. And you ought to be supported through data and perhaps through resource to be able to tackle some of those problems, because once you can see that change is possible, you're going to invest more time in it. So I think we do need to kind of rethink some of this and build up from what we've got a stronger governance structure. And I hope that the government's strategy will speak to some of this. I don't think it can be done just by asking people to work harder and to do more in their spare time. I think we've got to acknowledge that this work is important and needs to be resourced. It needs to be part of what it is to be a member of the family justice system, a professional within the family justice system. But I think that part of it is about really making clear what we're all working towards. If you think about when the local family justice boards were at their height of their influence, it was actually in the introduction of the initial introduction of the PLO, when the 26-week target was set for care proceedings. That's when all local family justice boards were tasked with bringing down delay. And it spoke directly to the National Family Justice Board's objectives. If we set some new objectives for the family justice system as part of this strategy, I think we need to see a sort of similar level of intensity of activity between the Family Justice Board and local family justice boards.
Mm, absolutely. And as you rightly say, there is a real there is a real difference in variation in how it is currently run and operated. And we spent a lot of time on Trailblazers compiling several examples of how different boards were operating and how they were tackling particular issues. Um, for the sort of very simple purpose that at the moment it's hugely beneficial for different boards to be able to see what other boards are doing and say, well, we also have similar challenges, and we need to be able to use the board in a different way, and we want to change how the board operates differently. It was really good to see that there were boards coming and saying, we want to set up a young people's subgroup to make sure that we are getting that feedback as through the LFJB the right way. How do we go about and do that? And that there is a real sort of desire that we've seen through the LFJBs to operate in a different way and to bring in more of that lived experience sort of feedback into what they're doing to then disseminate it at a system level, which I think is hugely important. But yes, absolutely, as you say, how do you connect the two things for top down and bottom up so that it really brings the two puzzle pieces together, and whatever a local family justice board has determined is their priority to address national priorities then neatly fits together.
Yeah, I mean, I think in any public service, you're looking at that kind of need for clarity, and particularly one where we have so many different parts, moving parts of the system. You need to be working together on some shared objectives, and fundamentally, that's what we're looking for the strategy to provide.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of minutes remaining on this, and I'm quite keen that anyone who has been listening in on the reflections and the conversation, that you can use the Q&A function to submit any questions, whether it's family justice related or more broadly, that Lisa and I are happy to field at this time. So if you just go to the bottom of the screen where the Q&A function is, that you can use that particular button to submit questions. So there is one that has popped up in here that reflects that yes, the system must always place children at the centre, and we have a long way to go to ensure that families are treated better, that the outcomes are the right outcomes. Resources are the challenge. That there's been that significant increase nationally in cases, and also complexity in cases. We know has really been driving some of that. And the reference that this hasn't slowed down since 2020 rightly points to the pandemic and the backlog and the risk aversion and the working in silos that unfortunately kind of got stuck as a result of needing to do some things virtually, but also struggling to push more things through in person. And it's a completely fair point that there is a real challenge on resources, and it's not sustainable in the long term. We know the system does largely run on goodwill, and that there are objectives. We're told that they're measured, but if we can't provide the right outcomes for children, then what is it that we're really measuring in here? It is the ongoing persistent challenge across multiple public services, which does not diminish the challenge in this space. I think what I would say in response to this at a really high level is I think the addition of a family justice strategy which acknowledges these challenges and tries to bring this into one place is a really positive development and step forward, because without the strategy having existed previously, you're absolutely right. It had kind of fallen into this grey area between policy and people, where practitioners were needing to make these changes, to make progress, and to operate that based on professional judgment and experience, and make sure that it was heading in the right direction and making sure that children and families were getting to the right place. But sometimes that's not necessarily enough. Lisa, what are your reflections on that?
Well, I hear the point about resources. It's clearly been over the last decade a really challenging time for all services. What I would say is that there are parts of our system that are spending a lot of money in a way that's not very effective for children's outcomes. And we've been doing a lot of work around children with, quite complex situations who end up on deprivation of liberty orders and tracing back their history as young people, what has happened to them in their lives and what might have helped to divert them from this crisis moment where they are normally in care and deprived of their liberty. And what we see from working with professionals is that there's often a lot of professionals involved in that child's life, but none of them feel fully responsible for that child as they see elements of their life for short periods of time rather than sticking with them. And it's not quite clear because there's not an obvious pathway or scheme for those young people. It's not quite clear who ultimately is responsible. And quite often there's a dispute between health and children's social care over who should pay for their care. And ultimately, we're spending a lot of money on really poor quality care for children who are deprived of their liberty, which is not achieving good outcomes for children. So that's an example of where we really need to take stock as a system of how we work together differently, how we intervene at a much earlier stage and stick with a child, rather than keep passing a child around a system where we don't quite know what to do with them. Where professionals have the time to really lean in and build relationships with a child and understand their story, rather than have a caseload where they feel they're just sort of dipping from one meeting to another, trying to avert a very high risk situation. But there is enough resource in the system to do things better. It's not resources here that's the problem. It's actually the way our systems are working that needs to change. So I'm not dismissing the resources issue overall, because I do hear the challenge, particularly for really hardworking professionals who are struggling with high caseloads. But I also think there are ways in which we could work differently that would be better for children within the same resource.
Mm. And sort of again, springboarding off what you've just said there as well, that we've got the question about, particularly around health services for children and families, is the absence of the NHS ICB from the Family Justice Board, or LFJB, is a significant absence. And the awkward answer is yes and no, that some LFJBs do have representation from the NHS, from healthcare colleagues, and from the ICB on the board, but not everybody does. And there's that real challenge of, again, reaching across different elements of services to bring them into one place. And what is the most sensible way of doing it? Is it the safeguarding partnership? Is it the LFJB? Is there another way?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up again time and time again with almost every family justice challenge. You know, if we've been working on how to improve the process by which babies are removed from their families when they're taken into care. Um, we are horrified to find that mums are expected to attend proceedings on the day that they give birth. In 20% of cases, the application is made on the same day as the first hearing, and mums are expected to attend hearings either remotely from hospital or sometimes in person, travelling from the hospital. Nobody thinks that's a good idea for them, for their child. Nobody wants that situation, but it's a combination of last minute decision making, the court requiring proceedings, and the hospital requiring mum to be discharged quite quickly after giving birth. It's not unless you can get all those parts of the system to work together can you avert that problem. So absolutely,
Mm.
health has to be at the table.
Absolutely. And just to answer a couple of more questions very quickly, off the back of that about the more integrated approach. So the question that we have here is that Families First is creating a more integrated approach to practice in local authorities. Should there be a Families First approach between the local authority and CAFCAS?
I think we have to join up these agendas all the way through the process. So I think whether you're CAFCAS, whether you're a magistrate or a family judge, we need to be working to the same agenda. We're all part of the same system. Our roles might be different, but we're all part of one system. So I think one of the challenges is that government hasn't seen it quite like that, and we need to try and shift the thinking of joining up the pieces that of the reforms that are being introduced. The strategy is a great opportunity for that, just to take stock of these various different initiatives and to think about the roles of different professionals in relation to them. So yeah, absolutely, you need to join that up.
Absolutely. And I will answer the final question as part of a quick bundle to bring this session to the close. The question was about the role of AI and what that might have on practice and resources in the family justice system. What I would specifically do here is signpost to what the Central London Trailblazer did during the pilot, which was to develop effectively a policy buddy for a sort of practice within the local area that any social worker could go in. It was only trained on the local policies and procedures and all the relevant legislation that it needed. And you could ask that. It was called a chatbot, but it wasn't really a chatbot. It was more of a policy buddy. And you could ask it questions to say, for example, how do I explain pre-proceedings or court proceedings to an 8-year-old? Or how do I explain this process to a family for whom English is not their first language? It was a really useful tool that addressed a particular element of practice within family justice and gave social workers a bit of a point of access and a point of reference. It didn't give specific instructions or advice. It was more of a selection of things for local authorities to consider and for social workers to consider as part of an AI tool that was, again, informed just by what had been put into it and taught on those particular resources. So I would highly recommend having a look on the Mutual Ventures website for that. But to bring this to a close, as we are at 1 o'clock, so we have talked a lot about what we would like to see, what will be coming up for family justice later this year. More immediately, in terms of what we would hope that attendees would take away for the coming months in your roles and in your systems, use what you already know about your local system and keep updating that. Because Trailblazers has shown that there is real value in taking the time to understand your own drivers of delay and then keep revisiting that and refining that understanding, particularly as pressures, capacity, and practice change with that landscape of wider children's social care reform continues to move. Because improvement is less about finding that one single solution and more about maintaining that habit of reflection and problem solving. We'd also say focus on the moments where practice can prevent escalation. So, early support, pre proceedings practice, family led decision making, they are still those really critical levers for reducing delay and improving experiences. Thinking about whether early activity in the system is genuinely creating clarity, engagement, and options for families, or whether it is procedural or inconsistent. But irrespective, you don't need to pursue the silver bullet because it's more about multiple acts on a system wide scale. And sometimes even really small acts and shifts can have a really positive and, in some places, disproportionate impact later in proceedings. And finally, draw on your local networks, your local family justice board, your local system, and others. Family justice right now does require a lot of different professionals to work across organisational boundaries together. But Trailblazers has taught us that those links and those interactions with colleagues are essential, as well as making sure that local governance enables everyone to work together in the right way. But if you feel like you're the only person who's experiencing what you're experiencing in family justice, you may not be. One of the really consistent things that came up in the program was that people felt really relieved that they weren't alone in the challenges that they were experiencing and could ask others for advice about what other local authorities, other courts, other judges had done to tackle delays in their areas. There are resources available and contacts that can help you, and you will not be by yourself in that challenge. So, as I mentioned, this is the final webinar in a series of 7 for the DFJ Trailblazers program. All of these webinars are available on our website, so please do check those out. Also available on our website is a host of family justice resources, both that were developed by mutual ventures and also by local areas during the pilot and during the National Learning and Strategy Programme. There's a huge amount that you can draw on there. You can see some examples of that on the screen there. So please do use those. Thank you very much, Lisa, for joining on and having this conversation today. It's been brilliant to talk through your insights and your experiences. And I would also encourage attendees to have a look at the NFJO's website for their brilliant research pieces. And finally, thank you everyone for engaging in the programme over the past couple of years. I mentioned that we've engaged with more than 400 people in the past couple of years, which has been huge. And we really appreciate the time and the energy and the participation of everyone who has taken part in both the pilot and phase 2 of this programme. If you do have any questions or would like a further discussion, please do reach out. But in the meantime, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoons.